that's where that line in the author's note, remember the author goes to India and meets this old man who eventually says to him, "I have a story that will make you believe in God." That story that will make you believe in God, I mean that. I did say that with intent. It wasn't just a lure, it was meant that the novel was supposed to exemplify that. This was supposed to be a story that was going to make you believe in God. Of course, you can't force anyone to believe anything. You have to have that openness, that willingness to somehow believe. And the story that will make you believe in God, other readers have told me, well, it's in the Pacific. It's that Pi overcomes adversity. That, as far as this reader is concerned, is not it. That one overcomes adversity proves nothing, other than one's toughness, one's resilience, etc. But it actually, ontologically, doesn't prove anything. To me, the proof of God, so to speak, was not in the story of the Pacific, is that there are stories. There are many stories that can be told about reality. And I reduced it to two stories in competition. One with animals, one without. And if you remember at the end of the novel, Pi goes in the Pacific, the ship sinks, he survives 227 days with the tiger, reaches the coast of Mexico. When a ship sinks, the same investigative process takes place as when a plane crashes. There's an investigation to find out why the ship sank. You don't hear about it because usually ships sinking or foundering doesn't make the news because no one dies. But it is the same process. So he reaches the coast of Mexico, and two Japanese investigators come to meet him to talk with him about the sinking of the ship. And in part 3, what you have is the encounter between a skeptic and a believer. The investigators are the skeptics, Pi is the believer. They don't believe the story. And so he comes up with a second story, if you remember. The story without animals, where instead of surviving with 4 animals, there's 4 human survivors. There's Pi, his mother, a French cook, and a Taiwanese sailor with a broken leg. And he tells him that story, and that story, no more than the first story, explains the sinking of the ship, which is really all the investigators care to find out about. That's what they're there for. They want to find out why did the ship sink, what can we learn from that. So, neither story explains that, so they're about to leave, and if you remember, Pi then asks him the key question in the novel, which is the better story? He doesn't ask him which is the true story, because after all, they weren't there. He was there. He's the only witness to whatever happened in the Pacific during those 227 days. Both stories start with the sinking of the ship. Both stories end with one human survivor who's lost everything in his life reaching the coast of Mexico. And between those two, there's no other witness but Pi. Everything comes through Pi. So he asked him, which is the better story? And if you remember, the younger investigator, Mr. Chiba, immediately says the story with animals. That's the better story. And Pi says, yes, thank you, and so it goes with God. That little, and so it goes with God line, links back to that. This is a story that makes you believe in God. What I was trying to point out is that belief in God is also simply a belief in a better story, for which there's no factual proof. You must take someone's word for it in any belief in God, whether it's a prophet, book, whatever. And I say that of any religion, or if you happen to be directly related by God, then you don't have to rely on someone else, but essentially belief in God relies on someone else's witness. And so I set those two stories in competition and Pi asked of the investigators, and I asked of the reader, which to you is the better story? Which do you want to believe, the story with animals or the story without? Now, both are doable, right? Both are plausible. Both are possible, and one is less plausible than the other. I mean, it is possible for tigers to survive in a confined space. They do every day in zoos. There are shipwrecks, including shipwrecks with animals. There even are plants that eat animals. Not usually as large as one that Pi finds in the Pacific. Venus flytraps are considerably smaller than Pi's island, but still, that is not impossible, just impossible. So you have these two stories in competition. And by my reading of the book, when I was writing the book, I said to myself, why would someone choose the lesser story? Why would someone choose the story that isn't the better story? Our time on earth is so short, why not choose the better story? So long as the story isn't flatly, factually impossible, then why not believe the better one? So I wrote Life of Pi as a result of a certain fatigue in myself. I studied, as I said, philosophy at university. I was quite good at it. I was good at being reasonable. And what happened in my life is that reason, in a sense, got out of control. I was becoming too reasonable. That pushed away religion is not a problem at all. But what I found is that it was also starting to push aside art. You have to be able to suspend disbelief to believe in the arts. And being overly rational, I was having more difficulty doing that. So, for example, novels especially were suffering. Because, any novel to work, you have to suspend your disbelief. That's the first sign of a book that doesn't work, is if you can't suspend your disbelief. If either it's so poorly written, or there's so many factual mistakes, that you say, oh, this doesn't work for me, I don't find these characters plausible, etc. That's a novel where you haven't suspended your disbelief, and it doesn't work. You have to suspend your disbelief to believe in the novel. And once you do suspend your belief in the novel, it works. It works as magic. And in fact, it's exactly the same thing with religion. Religion doesn't work, it's a cult. A religion that works is a religion. You have faith. You have to make that leap of faith. The leap is the same. And I was finding that I couldn't make a leap of faith in terms of religion, that was fine, but my leap of faith in art was also suffering. And so, luckily at that time, I happened to end up in India, and not, let's say, in Switzerland. Because in India, those of you who might be familiar with India, it's a dazzling country. They speak over 700 languages. It's an extraordinarily diverse country where hundreds of languages are spoken. So many religions. Every major religion on earth is practiced by someone somewhere in India. It's an extraordinarily diverse country. And I saw there how all stories are possible and we're the better for it. And so I got to India, and I suddenly realized that I was too beholden to reason. And what could I do about that? And I noticed a number of things in India. One of them, as I said, was the more benign presence of religion. It certainly isn't always benign in India. I don't want to simplify the situation, but from my perspective as a backpacker, I saw any number of people going to the temples, going to churches, going to mosques, in a way that was completely inoffensive. And because they were religions alien to me, Hinduism, Islam, Jainism, Buddhism, I didn't have a gut antipathy that I had for Christianity. And so I was taken by that. I was taken by the beauty of the ceremonies. When you see in a mosque, 200 people, Muslims pray together, they do it literally together, they move together. So to see 200, 300 people move in synchronicity, it's a beautiful thing to watch. You don't understand the word, they're Arabic, it doesn't matter, it's just beautiful to watch them. And the cry of the muezzin, a Muslim call to prayer, is also beautiful. And Hinduism, the Hindu temples are astonishing, especially in the south of India, architecture is just beautiful. I was taken in by that. For the first time in my life, I decided, hey, why don't I investigate not so much religion, but faith? If I'm tired of being reasonable, what's at the other end of reasonable? He says, well, religious faith. That's really deeply, deeply unreasonable. Why don't I investigate that? That'll be what I'm going to try to do with this story. Investigate religious faith, which I don't have, don't share, I didn't particularly respect, but in this case I will pose a character who has faith, and we'll see what happens to him. And the whole novel comes out of that curiosity about faith, coming out of a fatigue with being so reasonable. And as my other books did, I resolved that conundrum for me. I've become religious in a sort of non-denominational way. I'm happy in a Christian church, in a Catholic church, a Protestant church. I'm happy in a mosque. I'm happy in a synagogue. I'm happy wherever. Because in each I see a flawed attempt to go beyond our limitations and understand where we fit in this cosmos. And I've introduced a 180-degree switch where I used to think religion was no interest and silly to think, in fact, it's the most fascinating approach to life. And I say that, of myself, whether I believe in it or not. Just the language that religious people use, the perspective they have, I just find very interesting. Whether what they're saying is true or not is secondary. I'm just saying their approach, the kind of questions that religious people ask, are ones that I find endlessly engaging. One thing that was interesting about writing on Pi is that I investigated a lot of religions. Pi, if you remember, practices three religions, a Hindu, a Christian, and a Muslim. And so I looked